Shonda Rhimes, producer, screenwriter, and author, said something in her book, Year of Yes, that has seemed to stick with me. I can't waste precious time hovering in the what ifs and the if onlys. And I would say we actually can't waste precious time hovering in the what ifs and if onlys. This is why we're not just talking about equity today. It's why we're talking about winning on equity. We are delighted that you're here. And in fact, we want to begin by hearing from you. So I'd like to put up a poll to have you respond, and that'll give us some data for the rest of our discussion. Thank you. My name is Willis Selden. I'm a partner at the Bridgespan Group, and I want to introduce my co-presenter, Michael Mcafee. What I love about Michael Mcafee, President and CEO of PolicyLink, is that he's ambitious and he's driven to change the nation. Michael is creative, he's strategic, he's ethical, and he's all about results. It's a very powerful combination. I'm going to turn it to Michael to kick us off in our discussion today.
Thank you, Willa. It's good to be able to be on this panel with you. And thank you all for sharing space with us today. You know, this is an exciting opportunity. Let's go to the slides for a moment. You know, we are in an unprecedented moment where the equity movement has matured. And just as the equity movement has matured, all three sectors have come to racial equity: corporate America, every level of government, and civil society. And because work has been going on for so many years, there's a wonderful opportunity for us to do something that we couldn't do in previous years. That is to get a line of sight into thinking about how do we aggregate and deploy capital? How do we craft strategy in a results-based way? All in service of those 100 million in America who are struggling to make ends meet. We have an opportunity to step into the invitation that is ours, to continue to participate in this democracy, to design it so that it is just and fair for everyone. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Not just the funding side of the house, but how do you align the investors and the doers so that we can craft strategy to win? That's what this moment is about. Let's go to the next slide briefly. You know, when we think about winning on equity, this was born out of some of the strategic planning work that Bridgespan helped us with at PolicyLink as we went through our leadership transition from Angela to myself, where I wanted us to raise our gaze for a moment and ask, are we not just doing good work, but are we doing the work that will fundamentally usher in a just and fair society? Are we doing the work that would allow us to answer the most basic question? Is that 100 million better off because of our contribution? And winning on equity was born out of that. A way for us to raise our gaze as leaders in this movement, to join with others, to really begin to ask the question, what are some issues that we want to win on? How will we create a new ecosystem that is stronger than the one before to actually get the results that we want? That's what this opportunity is, and that's what this research is about. This research that allows us to begin to create key infrastructure for our movement. You know, every sector can tell you how their capital is aggregated and deployed. And we're still in the infancy stages of being able to do that. And so today we're going to have conversations that allow us to begin to think about just that. How do we align our contributions so that we can accelerate this nation being designed to be just and fair for everyone? So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back to you, Willa.
Thank you, Michael. Next slide. So to actually win on equity, it means that we have to change our mindsets. And not just our mindsets, we also have to change what we do. This means that we have to center the 100 million people that are living at or near poverty. That allows us a collection of us to see this as critical work. We also have to recognize that racial equity is the work. And we know that there's going to be a spectrum of perspectives and work that people will do in service of racial equity. It will span the polling information that we shared with you earlier, folks that may be race neutral to those that basically see racial equity as the work. But we need a significant body of people that actually see racial equity as the work to actually make these changes occur. And in doing so, it means also doing this in a way that brings your full set of assets to this work as important. So it's not just, again, as Michael began, it's not just about philanthropy. It's about our collective assets to make this work. We also see this work very much as long-term intergenerational work. It took hundreds of years for us to get where we are today. It will take hundreds of years, and we hope less, to get to these next stages. But this work needs to be funded and supported as though it will take time to actually succeed. And it's funded and supported in ways that suggest that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to have successes. And part of the reason we're going to have successes is because we did make those mistakes. So we can't see racial equity work and the folks who's doing it as having to be perfect in everything they do. In fact, that's a disservice to the work that has to be done. And both philanthropy and nonprofit partners have to step up. Let's go on to the next slide. We use the definition that Mcafee had, this organization that's focused on philanthropic members that come together to really orient around transformative investments for the Black community. And their definitions of what to fund and their guidance gave us insight into what was needed, but it was also reinforced by all of the organizers and social change leaders we spoke with about what it would take to win on equity. So we think this is actually a great frame to use in terms of the breadth of work that has to happen. And a critical part of that is this connective infrastructure that's going to be required that strategically links organizations and networks and leaders across issues and across geographies. The problems that we face with regards to equity are interconnected. We see that increasingly in the work that we do, which means our work together must also be interconnected. I'd like to turn off the presentation now. Great. Michael, great to be with you as always. The poll we just conducted showed that a number of people said that they basically are doing work where they see racial equity as the work. Most people also said that they see themselves as supporting racial equity work. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that. Does that surprise you? Was that exciting? Is it concerning to you? And where do we need philanthropy and nonprofits to fall on that scale of advancing racial equity?
Sure. It's exciting to me. Yeah, it's exciting to me. This is it's a powerful moment in our nation's evolution. Now, while it's exciting, there are some things that I think we should pay attention to. The first is this: you can be focusing on racial equity work and not really bringing about the type of racial equity that's going to change the number for that 100 million, get it going down. And we need to always be clear about that. There is good work to alleviate immediate human need in this country, and that is important, but with all due respect, Meals on Wheels should not have to be anything more than what it is, providing high quality, delicious, nutritious meals to folks on time. It's not the vehicle to transform the food delivery system in America. And we need to hold both of those now. And that's what I mean by a mature movement. We can do immediate human relief, and we can tend to the design challenge of the nation. And so this work is so important because we've got a real example right in front of us: voting rights. Our misalignment has us suffering in a huge way. We fetishized Georgia. We fetishized it. We fetishized a few leaders and we got captivated by what they were doing. But the reality is this: People of color should not have to be superhuman just to vote, right? And so we got all titillated by Georgia, but we lost the rest of the country because we weren't asking the ecosystem questions. What would it actually take for us to defend voting rights across this country? What would be the infrastructure needed to defend it and then to advance something that wasn't just in a defensive posture? And that's the essence of the work that we're trying to do together, to get us to be able to ask those questions. What do you want to win, and how do you organize yourselves to win? And not just be busy doing work that is important and significant, but losing the nation nonetheless. So that's what we're trying to get to. And, when I think about what you've helped us do, Willa, in getting more strategic about our own work, you hear me often say that we know there's a lot of money in the market, but it's not all headed in the right direction or the most results based. What advice would you give folks about how to be more impactful investors? Because what we're offering is not a critique. It is simply saying, we're ready to get bigger results. So how do we do it? So what would you advise them?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that we do know a lot more about what's going to be, because what we've been doing isn't working to actually fundamentally change the system and the structures that we're living in. And that's what's really brought you to this moment, to say what we're doing is we're doing work. And it's not to say some of that work might not be good work, but it's not the work that's going to really fundamentally change things. So as we think about what it might really take, we often say philanthropy is risk capital. That's a term that people often describe with regards to philanthropy. But at the end of the day, the work of winning on equity, as you've talked about, it's not about risk capital. There's a portion of that might be risk capital, but really it's about the capital that's needed year in and year out to make it work. And so it's a long game that we're playing. It requires sustained funding. And investment of both money and also our best minds to the work. And so I would say one is to shift our paradigm of the role of philanthropy with regards to equity. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, I think, philanthropy can't see itself as not as just a funder in this work. It actually has to be a co-partner in the work. It has to be a partner in the work. It has to see itself as part of the work and join in with others in actually getting this work done. And so that means that in terms of that partnership, it has to be about its full set of assets, the notion of bringing wisdom, the notion of bringing resources, the notion of bringing influence, its own networks. And that really shifts the balance of how we think about what philanthropy does. Philanthropy needs to be partnered alongside movement actors as opposed to just funding them. And then I would also say that there are a number of folks that are new to this work or see themselves as relatively new or see themselves as in a place of risk in pursuing it. But there's no reason to wait to get involved. There's possibilities to kind of do while learning. And so in that regard, I know there was another piece that we'll have coming out that Michael, you co-wrote as well, talking about the role of being involved with regranters, the role of being involved with other collaboratives, whether it's with folks like the Groundswell Fund or the Democracy Frontlines Fund, but basically joining others while you use that as an opportunity to learn, but rather than waiting to act and then continue learning.
That's right. What's exciting about what you're saying is that, while there are actions that philanthropy can take, there are also actions that those of us who are squarely in the nonprofit sector can take. For example, we've got to get clear about what are the leading edges of the equity movement. And we should be defining that and setting the contours of it, and not just allow grant making to dictate that. There are things and there's wisdom and insight that is born out of our work, and it should be placing us on the leading edge. For example, one of those for us at PolicyLink is that as the federal government steps into racial equity, it's not an initiative. The North Star of good governance is governing with a racial equity consciousness. That is how you get to governing for all. And so we should be setting these North Stars for sectoral leaders to come to. That's critically important. But we also should continue to join, like I've been seeing over the last several years, in what we call transformative solidarity, abandoning ourselves to each other's strengths, aligning around powerful results, figuring out what competencies each of us will hold and contributions we will make, and creating the conditions to be in that work for the long haul. Practically, what that looks like is PolicyLink is making sure that, annually now more than $3 to $4 million is going to our grassroots colleagues. When we're writing proposals, our grassroots siblings are in those proposals. We're joined at the hip in doing that work. When it comes to our federal work, Race Forward and PolicyLink aren't going it alone. We are inextricably bound now, figuring out how to advance an agenda when it would be easy for us just to do our own thing. But that doesn't mean we're not going to get big results if we do that. And so getting into these relationships and really struggling like a family, how do you get in alignment, right? I mean, we've been meeting Race Forward and PolicyLink. We've been meeting for over 2 years, sharing everything from our funding strategies to our core operating budgets to having our management teams meet to recently holding a retreat down in Half Moon Bay to really strategize about over the next 5 years, how will we move this racial equity governing agenda at the federal level? That's the type of relationships we've got to be in. Move from the transactional to really thinking about transformative solidarity.
I think this is such an important topic that you're raising, this issue of how do we begin to see ourselves as partners in a shared enterprise as opposed to competitors for funding, et cetera. And I think it's a hard step for a lot of organizations to see things that way. We continue to be in situations where we're taking pot shots at each other or trying to elbow each other out. And I would be interested to hear you talk a little bit about, Michael, what does it take to make that transformation, to see things in that way and to actually begin to see the folks you might see as, I don't know, competitors in some way, or folks that, compete for funding alongside you versus others, versus seeing them as folks that should be alongside you actually in doing the work?
Well, I'll just talk about my own journey because I think it's important for us to kind of struggle in this work, because then you'll figure out how to do it. There are 2 parts of the Equity Manifesto that are very important to me. The first sentence says it begins by joining. And the second is a phrase where it talks about how you apply grace to do this work. The reality is this: while collaborations can drive me crazy because that's not my preferred style, when I'm holding the interest of that 100 million, if I really want to achieve results, there's no other path but to do that work. So when you're doing the right work, it will force you to do the thing that you don't even like to do because that's what the work necessitates. So if you're doing soul work, which that's all I want to do with the rest of my life, it will force me to join, and it will force me then to do the work to be in authentic relationships with people. And while it drives me crazy, it's some of the funnest stuff that I've ever done in my career. So that's the first thing, to join by really holding out a powerful population level result and then going for it, because it will pull you out of your comfort zone. It will be disruptive to your leadership. But the second is also to recognize that, when you have a certain level of privilege, we should have learned from how we were oppressed and to do something different. That's why I shared that number of how much of while we're not a foundation, there should be a significant portion of our dollars going to those folks on the ground who often don't have the access that we have. But in addition to that, we should be creating the conditions for those folks to have access. So part of the job that I think those of us with privilege have to do is to create space and to see this world as an abundant world. I mean, think about it. We're talking about from intention to impact, more than $70 billion in the marketplace. It's not a money problem. It's a problem of, can we exert our leadership to begin to influence how capital is aggregated and deployed? And if we're acting like crabs in a barrel, we'll never do that. So that will always mean some of us will be successful and others will lose. What I'm most pleased about right now is there's something that's happening in the sector that is exciting. Folks are tired. They're tired of not winning. They're tired of fighting amongst themselves. More important, they just want to do the work that we've been struggling to do ever since we came into the field. And there's a new zeitgeist about this work. Folks want to join. Folks want to do transformative work. And that's the gift. I've never seen that. Just as I've never seen all three sectors come to this work. I've never seen executives from the grassroots all the way to national organizations actually wanting and seeking each other out to do this work. We've grown up. And now as we grow up, if we can continue to have the grace to keep on being expansive. Angela said something to me that was really important once, and I think it's important for how we go forward. When she was talking about equity, she said to me once, you know, Michael, sometimes you've got to put a concept out there even when people don't agree with it or they're uncomfortable by it, and to create the space for them to see themselves in it. And as we think about winning on equity, we're at that moment again, where our jobs are to talk about transformative solidarity, that are talk about abundance, and create the space for folks to not just see those as fancy words, but begin to see themselves in our budget line items, et cetera. And I think when John Gardner talks about self-renewal, et cetera, this is a way for us to renew our institutions, for them to fully step into racial equity and to make it real.
You know, I think that this is one of the reasons why we talked about mindset and philanthropy, because what you're talking about is so different from I'm not going to say it's the current mindset, but certainly the traditional mindset of philanthropy as being separate from, as not wanting to necessarily engage, not necessarily wanting to join in that way. And it really, we've been obviously having some discussions with various organizations that are at that moment. They're also saying the same things. How do we move forward? We care about this. We want to see this happening. And we see that what's happening, what we have been doing, isn't getting us to the success that we want. So I completely agree. We're at a different stage of the conversation. And I think success means doing what you're talking about, which is that I'm willing to step into spaces that feel uncomfortable, that aren't necessarily what I've typically done, and learn with you with the combined intent that we're both trying to accomplish something together, which means there is risk in that. And there needs to be, and I completely agree, we need to have, one meeting people called it Brother Grace and Sister Mercy show up, because that's the work we have to do. Back to our group that's here with us today, we really want to also give you some time to talk together about some of these issues, and to also think about the questions that you have that you want to bring back to the larger group. We'll have plenty of time for discussion of your questions. But we want to give you some time to talk amongst yourselves. And Michael and I will be joining a group as well. So let's take a few minutes to do that. We'll give you about 10 minutes or so to do that. And then we'll come back into the bigger group for a broader discussion. So delighted that you're here.
Hey, Colton,
Yes.
were the questions supposed to be posted in each Zoom room? And I probably shouldn't have went into a room, but that's fine. But were the questions supposed to be posted somewhere?
I'm working on I did a broadcast message. It looks like when they join the Zoom room, it changes what chat you're allowed to see.
Yeah, because I didn't see any question in our chat in the room I was in.
Okay, I might just go around to all the rooms and post it there.
Okay, please do. Hey, Colton,
Yes.
the room, the breakout rooms need to end at 3:50. It's showing 1 o'clock, I guess, in one of the sessions. And so just to let you know that they're supposed to end in 3 minutes instead of 1 p.m. or instead of 4 p.m. 3:50 instead of 4 p.m.
Is it 55 or is it 50? Because I remember the discussion before the meeting started, they said 55.
Right. I just now got an email from Anthony. He's saying, could we end the small groups around 12:50? So that's meaning
Okay.
they ended at 3:50. So maybe that's a change that they may have sent to Anthony, and Anthony reached out to me.
Okay. Will do.
All right.
Time, but what? Mhm.
Well, I'm so happy that we were able to do this breakout group. We'd be really interested to hear from you all. I don't know if it's possible to put everybody on the screen at one time or not. Otherwise, we can just hear through the chat as well. It's fine too. But we'd love to hear from you reactions from your discussions, questions that you have, so we can be a bit informal today. I'll share a question that came up in our group that I thought was especially powerful. The person we were with said, basically, what are we willing to risk? You know, we're in some cases needing to take care of our families or take care of our communities. And yet we're working for employers, other folks that aren't really doing the work. And yet we have that circumstance. So what are we willing to risk? I'd ask you, Michael, to love to hear your reflections on that.
Well, you know, I think this, in many ways, this is how I came to PolicyLink, asking these questions. You know, I was raised where my mom and dad knew enough. They loved me enough to say, baby, just get that good government job. And they sent me to private school when busing started, and that was what they could give me. And that's what I worked for. And got fired in Kansas City for trying to find my voice around this work. And then I went to HUD to lick my wounds and figure out things. And it was actually participating in the Annie Casey Children and Families Fellowship where I realized I was just like, wow, you know, HUD is great, but this is as good as it gets, right? And there was a day where I was cleaning up because I'm really OCD about having everything in order. And my mother had given my wife some newspaper clippings of me and back in the day. And I picked up a book by Eckhart Tolle, The Purpose of Now, and out of it fell this quote with the picture of my younger self talking about what it meant to lead and all this stuff. And I was like, what happened to that person? because
Wow.
I had gone to HUD to lick my wounds, to buy me some property so I never have to worry about walking away again, and found my wife, and I was starting to get distracted from my vocation. And it was Donna Stark at Casey one day who said, Michael, there's this amazing opportunity at PolicyLink. When you're in New York, just go interview with them. And since I had decided that I would never, ever let people interview me again, I started telling the recruiter all these things that I would do if I got this job to kind of test for commitment again, because I'm still scared to leave security now for this thing. And it was actually my wife who gave me the courage to leave. She says, you know, Michael, this is your vocation, man. And if you don't do it, you're dead right now in this cubicle at HUD. And that's how I ended up on the West Coast at PolicyLink, struggling with wanting to have greater contribution in the world, knowing that I could, but afraid because I know how hostile it is. And, you know, folks in Kansas City sent me to anger management to talk to a woman named Dr. Dottie Fanningstill for a year because my passion was perceived as anger. And so when it comes to this question, we all have to be willing to suffer loss. It's never as great as what our ancestors gave us. But, you know, there's a peace in my spirit about this moment because the victory really is already ours if we step into it right now. You know, folks are pushing back on this, but we're making progress in this nation. And we just need to hold on to that. You know, but the thing for me is to never get intoxicated by these positions. They're not ours. We're renting them. And our job is to go like hell, not be a martyr, absolutely be smart, but we're here to do the work. And it helps when you're street smart and you come from poverty. I had some of my best time being poor. I didn't know I was poor, you know, playing outside with my BB gun and riding my bike. I don't want to go back to that, but I know how to get back up and figure out a way forward. And I think that's what the diversity of those of us with lived experience brings to this. We're not afraid of power. We're not afraid to get hit. Hell, we've been getting hit our whole life. And so the question simply is, how do we create space for folks to get comfortable with smartly thinking about how are you prepared for the loss that you might suffer? You know, one of the most amazing things I think we could do in this field is actually have an emergency relief fund for leaders who lead boldly. Think about all the fellowships out there. Imagine if they just had a relief fund that could help someone pay their mortgage or their rent when they get crossways in something, simply for doing good work. So get comfortable with loss is inevitable. And as we think about movement infrastructure, some of the best movement infrastructure could be thinking about where do leaders go to rebound? I was just out there on my own, and it was by the grace of God that I found another reason to be able to do this work. But there's too many leaders of color who are just out here struggling and don't have those anchors to help them stay steady when they get bounced. So that's what I would say. This work is about loss and a renewal. So let's just factor that into our lives. I don't spend more than I need. I don't get a lot of debt so that I can always walk or get bounced and still survive. And more importantly, to think about the 100 million are suffering loss every day. Mm-hmm. And that if I really am afraid of losing, there are other sectors I can go to. I don't have to be in this seat. So if you're in the seat, do the job. Or find another position. Yeah.
I'm with it, Michael. And I think the other thing about it is I also think people can play different roles. You know, I think about the power of what people have done. It may not have been in their day job as what they did when they left their day job, what they did at night, what they did at weekends, and the difference that they made and have made in their communities, and the subtle things they've done in their companies and organizations to make a difference, both for people, because obviously someone looked out for you, and that's led you on this path. So I think there are many paths to making a difference. Other questions you guys have or comments that you have that came up in your sessions or that you want to raise into this conversation? You can welcome to use the chat or whatever would work.
What are you thinking?
Hi, everybody. So I was thinking about that initial question about the needs that we see in terms of new mindset. So I have been kind of in this space where I'm cautiously, I don't even want to say optimistic, but I'm cautiously just looking at the sector and this new kind of space where everybody's like support BIPOC-led organizations, support BIPOC leaders, and I'm just like, this feels like a very transient moment that at any given point when people are like, all right, are we done with this now? They're gonna move on to something else. So when I think about organizations that are putting a stake in the ground and saying we're supporting Black-led organizations, but where are the ones who are also supporting the pipeline of Black leaders coming up? Because to me, if you're gonna put a stake in the ground and I know that you're serious, then you're gonna be supporting the succession plans for the leaders that are coming up, and you're gonna make that long-term investment. And in my research, maybe I've seen two, one in New England, and it's a community foundation, and the other one I'm forgetting where I started, but I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, what you're seeing in terms of that long-term investment, if we're really serious about equity.
Michael, you want to kick off or?
No, please, Will.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely organizations. I've talked with a number of leaders that have that are white and that have basically themselves made a decision to retire themselves, and they really are looking for their next successor as a person of color. So that goes to the point that Michael raised earlier about people making brave choices. That it's not just about themselves, but about what does it mean to help serve the country. And so I think that's a very powerful statement of making that choice. And we also have to create, I agree, pipelines of leaders. You know, one of the things I think that's very distinctive about Michael and other leaders like Michael is, you know, he is also devoted to his craft as a leader and what it means to be excellent in the work, and what it means to be excellent in the results that we seek. And so we also have to see equity as a place and the work we're trying to do to win on equity as a place where we have to bring excellence to that work, because it's the way that we actually will make progress. It's the way that we all make progress. And so we have to see those things as not in contradiction, but completely aligned. And to do so, it does mean that we also have to make space for our talent that's coming up. You know, certainly Bridgespan, our push into equity, a lot of it came through our junior staff and the commitment that they had and how important it was to them to see a future that was different at Bridgespan than the future that we had. And as leaders, we listened to that and leaned into it. And it's also created opportunities for those team members to improve their skills, to make a contribution that's bigger than what they might have been able to do under an old system, and to make a difference that's very meaningful. That's going to help seed the field. So that notion of creating the pipeline, investing in the pipeline of talent, having a commitment to creating excellent talent and creating opportunity is something I think is very important about this work. And there's not enough of it being done. I completely agree. Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll give you, when you really make equity a non-negotiable, you'll see a couple of things happening. So this is a perfect example of what you're raising as new type of infrastructure and ecosystems that we need, right? Like that's a new area that we should be building out. At PolicyLink, what it meant is, you know, Angela said to me once on a walk, she says, you know, Michael, people don't really pay us to think. There's not a lot of places folks can go to think that are of color. And at a time when the most educated group is Black women, there are not many places you can go organizationally and feel free when you walk over that threshold every day to do your best work. So what that has meant for PolicyLink, to your point of building out future generations, is we actually had to build out a fiscal sponsorship capability. A fiscal sponsorship capability that was not about trying to go out and start a new line of business, if you will, but it was to honor what I have had at PolicyLink, a place to go be my unfiltered Black self to do the best work I can. And that has meant that we are incubating now Liberation in a Generation, Liberation Ventures, Samson Yangwei, who is a part of Black Lives Matter, doing data work there, is coming into the fold. These are institutions that had gotten out here in the world and only suffered one problem. Philanthropy didn't know them. They got all the credentials you would want. They're brilliant, and they just didn't have enough time to survive, meaning for people to get comfortable with them. So in some cases, it meant we had to share some of our general operating support with them to keep them going until their fundraising could take off. In others, it meant they needed coaching from our staff, different people on our staff. But what it has ultimately meant is that fiscal sponsorship capacity is a place for Black and brown people simply to come and have the freedom to try to advance their ideas, not be PolicyLink, but just come and give your ideas a shot and have a safe space to do that. And if you fail, we got you. And so that's what equity looks like in real time, right? That's how you cultivate the next generation of leaders. I could have easily said, along with the PolicyLink staff and board, we don't have time to do that. But that's the movement needs that. Their ideas are brilliant. And how tragic is it that they just don't have the capital, the social capital for funders to see that brilliance yet. And so just a real world example of those of us with privilege, what we can begin to do to create space for folks just to begin to have time to put their ideas in the world and give them a chance to stick.
Other
Thank
questions you
both
all
for-
have?
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Other questions you all have, you can put them in the chat, you can raise them out loud, whatever makes sense for you.
What else is on your mind?
Hi, I have a question. You spoke earlier about doing this work of advancing justice across sectors. And I know you spoke to the social sector and the nonprofit sector. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what the private sector is really doing. You know, obviously the pledges and whatnot, but we're 18 months in, and I'm curious if you're seeing the transformative change there that could be helpful.
Michael, do you want to kick off and then I'll pick up?
I have a love-hate with the private sector right now. The pledges were mostly, the financial pledges were mostly smoke and mirrors. Most of it was loans, things like that. But on the other side, as we're working with corporations, I know one of the biggest retailers who has centered racial equity in ways that if you saw their strategic documents right now, it would blow your mind. To think that they have centered racial equity and have prioritized Black folks as their target market in terms of how they're going to be successful in this nation, it would blow your mind. I've seen organizations like JP Chase call out Black pathways and actually begin to create that talent pipeline. They're no longer talking about, well, we don't know if we can find the talent. They've created the pipeline. We've seen tech companies go to some of our historically Black colleges and create the talent pipeline into those places. We're seeing corporations struggle with what should their response be? How do they make a political play for this voting rights issue? So what I can say is this. Every last one of us can offer a critique about all of our organizations and about all that's happening in the world, no doubt. I've never seen, as up close and personal as I am with corporate America right now, them really coming to this work. Now, the thing that I'm trying to get people to think about is, how can you accelerate it? Because it's really hard for me to sit in the room with you on one side of the house where you're working with us, and the other side of the house, you're creating an economy that remains oppressive, right? And so that is really hard to hold when people are still harming your family members. It's the same way, though, with doing federal government work. It's hard to hold folks in government who, some are trying to come to this work, or the institution is, and others are designing a world where we can't participate fully. So I see all of it. And this is where I think for leaders now, I've had to learn to grow up before I implode. And this is why I use the word grace. You know, if you can't work with imperfection, you're not going to be successful in this world. You know, people could offer 1,001 critiques still of PolicyLink. You know, and so none of us is above that. But the world is complex and messy. And if you're going to lead people to it, you got to deal with folks who are struggling and trying to get it. That's our gift and our work. And it's also our curse. And so I've had to get with that. So the private sector has a long way to go, but I know generally I've never seen so many corporations come to it the way I'm seeing them.
And I would agree with Michael. I went to a session with a number of companies talking about their equity movement. And one of them, which is a large corporation, you all would know the name, basically had a senior meeting that came together to talk about a number of things. And the CEO looked at the room and he said, "We're not having this meeting until this composition changes." Boom. I haven't been in any meetings at nonprofits that have said that, basically. Let's stop. We're not having this meeting until this room looks different. So I do think there are companies that are doing amazing work. There is this, companies are complicated because they're at the same time kind of working on their profitability and doing things that are about, kind of how do you make money and how do you meet the needs of Wall Street, et cetera. And yet on the other side, they're doing these other pieces. And, we've seen in successful movements, we saw in kind of the move towards approving gay marriage, it took a lot of unlikely allies that came together to make that happen. And so I do think that, we're going to be at the issues, and that we can't be at the point of saying that everybody has to basically line up, feel similarly, do everything the same before we work together, because that's not going to work. We'll never get there. And so, we have it in the philanthropic sector, where we have unlikely allies that are coming together to make certain things happen. And so that requires a certain level of sophistication, and I'd like Michael's term grace, about how do you manage those relationships, and also be clear that, we're not going to be together about everything, but on this thing, we're aligned, and the outcome we know is the right outcome. So, let's make this happen. But a recognition that, we're not going to agree about everything. And that doesn't mean I can't be in a room with you, and it doesn't mean that I can't do certain things. But we have to be clear about where the boundaries, and when we make those choices, where are the boundaries, and how do we think about that? One last question.
I have a question, if I can. First of all, thank you for this really engaging conversation. And I wonder, you talked about you wanting to understand where the greatest contribution or the results were. And I wonder what you're looking at and thinking about as you kind of try to figure out where the greatest kind of levers or opportunities are.
Well, thank you for the question. See, I think what you're asking right there, I think that's the work for us. I mean, think about it, take the wealth gap as an example, the racial wealth gap. It was created out of public policy. GI Bill, FHA. You actually can't close it without additional public policy at that scale. And so, see, when you start talking about population level impact and then start taking any issue that you care about, it's going to take you into a redesign of the nation. The racial wealth gap and closing it is wishful thinking. I'll give you a good example. Less than 5 miles from where I live, you could buy these big mansions in the 70s for about $150,000. Only problem was there were deed restrictions. Folks who looked like me couldn't buy them. Today, they're like $6 million, $7 million and up. So how do you close a racial wealth gap when you've given someone that significant of a head start? That's just in the 1970s. And so this is what we mean by, if you're really into racial equity, you got to get honest about what the impact is. You can't close the racial wealth gap with a $5 million initiative to do what? I just told you there's 100 million people struggling to make ends meet. That's 1 in 3 people. 48% of them are white. So this world isn't even working for white folks, almost half of them now. So when you start asking the question that you raised, you will begin to discover that that is what the opportunity is for us now. To be playing at the design level of this nation, all the while we're tending to the immediate needs of folks because they need that help today. And so that's why this work with Bridgespan is so important, because if we can get the investors and the doers in the room, and to begin to take an issue like the racial wealth gap and really struggle to say, if we really wanted to close it, what would it take? That's the opportunity to think of collective impact, not just as a programmatic strategy, but as a nation building strategy. Man, think about what would happen if we did that. And so that's what we're pursuing together here by doing this report, by beginning to hold our first ever investor summit in 2022, and beginning to raise this capacity. Much like we often think of capacity building for programs and services, you now see us thinking about collectively, what is capacity building for our movement and our sector, so that we can operate in the ways that would allow us to ask a question about the racial wealth gap and ultimately earn the right to expect that an indicator is going to trend in the right direction.
Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you all. Thank you, Willie.